Shana Tova to you all. I'm going to ask that you take a moment with me to indulge. Try going with me back in time, in the Wayback Machine. I want you to imagine for a moment that our community's been picked up and placed right down in this very same spot in the year 1950. And I know there are some of us here who can even remember that. Right here. Well, it wouldn't have been right here. It would have been the second year of the synagogue's operation at this location, right in the social hall. Imagine, on the way in, certainly not enough pegs to hang all the men's hats that would have been there. Not much traffic on the streets of Hyannis. Certainly not the level of development that we have today. And frankly, not so many Jews. And for those who did brave their way down to the Cape in the earlier days, where did you buy a house? Back then it mattered. Would all the neighbors be welcoming of a new Jewish neighbor? Think about it. How about a black one? How about an openly gay couple? 1950? Probably not. Sad thing is there was nothing unusual about the Cape at that time, because frankly, just about anywhere in America, the story would be the same. There were Jewish neighborhoods, black neighborhoods, Italian ones, and so on. At that time, not so much luck for the gays. No such tolerance. How far we've come. Tolerance of difference was not necessarily the virtue of the United States at that time. It was more of an ideal than a reality. In 1948, the Academy Award for the Best Picture went to anyone? A Gentleman's Agreement, starring Gregory Peck. What was the movie about? Gregory Peck playing a reporter who goes undercover as a Jew. It's a wonderful scene in that movie, which in many ways is dated, where he's looking in the mirror and he looks at himself and he says, I've got darker skin, I've got darker hair, I can pass. Nobody will know. Simple truth is, we still know where we're welcome and where we are not. There really was never a question in our minds or anybody else's about us being a distinct people. As the great writer Bernard Malamud once quipped, if you ever forget you're a Jew, a Gentile will remind you. Sooner or later it comes back to you and you know who you are. So let's roll back through the years, back to our present, and consider Jewish peoplehood again. How many of us still think today in terms of peoplehood? It seems to go against the tenor of our times. We're supposed to meet each person as he or she is and accept them on their merits, without regard to the color of skin, ethnicity, or religion, simply on merit. Of course, there's an enormous difference between supposed to and the reality of our present lives. Anyone who's ever crossed the street or made extra room on the sidewalk based on the appearance of someone approaching knows the truth. Deep down, we often act in ways that we wish we didn't. Now, the flip side of that gut-level identification of others is the corresponding self-identification we have. Take a moment and think of the first word that pops into your mind if I ask you to describe yourself. Was it your profession? Your family name? Your citizenship? Your ethnicity? If you go down the list a few items, I'm sure the word Jew pops up in the top 5. In prior generations, I'm sure that it would rarely be outside the top 2. It's no accident. Jennifer just sang the Great Aleinu beautifully. It's a special tune for Rosh Hashanah. What you may not know about the prayer Aleinu, which is in our daily prayers as well, is that it was first introduced specifically for the high holidays, for Rosh Hashanah, all the way back in the 3rd century. It's one of those prayers that we all sing, but we don't always think about what it means. In traditional Jewish law and halakha, it is so important that it was required that everybody present in the synagogue sing it. The text of the Aleinu is so well known. I'm sure if I started to sing it, you'd have it in a second. Aleinu l'shabech l'Adon hakol. Right. But what does it actually say? It's upon us to praise the Master of all, to ascribe greatness to the author of creation, who has not made us like the nations of the lands, nor placed us like the families of the earth, who has not made our portion like theirs, nor our destiny like all their multitudes. Now that you hear it in English, would you still sing it as loud? It should actually make us a little bit uncomfortable, shouldn't it? We're so different from everybody else. How many of us in 2013 and 5774 are willing to stand by the statement that as a people, Jews are fundamentally different from others? Can you make a statement of positive group identity today and be anything but a racist? Well, why am I even thinking about this? Let me tell you a story. As I hope you know, I volunteer at the Union for Reform Judaism camps in Western Massachusetts every year now for the last 6 years. My 6th year at Crane Lake Camp, I had an interesting run-in this year. You should note that every year there's a sizable mishlachat, a group of Israelis that are specifically recruited to come and work at the camps, to give our young people the experience to live and interact with Israelis. Well, my role at the camp is to be faculty. We're supposed to impart the Jewish knowledge to the kids. I've got a group of 8th and 9th graders I'm working with. Now, have any of you have ever taught 8th and 9th graders? You know they can be somewhat challenging. And so I always try and come up with something that I think will grab them right where they are. And so we were working on some ethical problems, specifically dealing with identity. And kids at that age really wrestle with it. So here was the problem I came up with. Your family's hiring somebody for work. There are 2 final candidates. One is Jewish, the other isn't. Should that have any influence on your hiring decision? They're equally qualified in every other way. Nothing stands out one about the other. It was a great discussion because they were understandably troubled. Should I? Shouldn't I? I know I shouldn't, but there's part of me that thinks I should. What do you do? Interestingly enough, when I flipped it around and I asked, now imagine you were the person applying for a job and you knew your employer was Jewish. Would you telegraph that you were too? Almost all their hands went up. There's the way we wish the world was, the way we think it should be, and the way we know it is. Well, one of the counselors in this unwieldy group of 38th and 9th graders was part of that mishlachat. He had already done his service in the Israel Defense Forces. He had been in intelligence. He's a very bright young man who was devoting his life towards becoming an educator. Well, he was quite upset by the conversation. And he confronted me both before and after the class, the lesson. He said, how could you say such a thing to these kids? I said, what did I say? I presented them with a problem. He says, how could you put those ideas in your heads? What you're doing is what we in the military would call psyops, psychological operations against the enemy. You're putting ideas in their heads that they would never have otherwise. I said, what? You think these kids have never thought that before? Have never wondered where they belong? It was quite the discussion. Because here was a guy who was telling me when he had control of his platoon and leadership of his platoon, when it came time to do national service, he made the point of taking his platoon only to Palestinian areas. They went to hospitals where there were Arab Israelis in the hospital so that they would go there to clean up and to wipe the tushes and to recognize the humanity of every single person. I said, that's lovely. But how does that affect this? I asked him, aren't we all family? Aren't we a people? Doesn't that matter? If it was your cousin applying for the job, wouldn't you take that into account? And he dismissed me. He said, yeah, I'm Segula, treasured people. I said, no, not a theologically treasured people. What about a people at all? What about just being Am? Lior is a good man, an officer, concerned for the future of Israel, and he insisted, all people are the same, and we show no preferences at all. He identified as an Israeli, much more than he did as a Jew. I was troubled, to say the least, not surprised that a younger generation of Israeli identifies more as an Israeli than as a Jew. But I had to ask, if we're not sending our kids to camp to build their sense of being a Jew, to being a part of our history and our future people, then why are we sending them at all? Brings me back to the words of Aleinu. Are we or are we not something different? A distinction has to be made. Difference does not imply superiority. And I think this is something that has dogged us for a long time. Difference does not imply superiority. Let's face it. Our people come from all over the world, across narrow confines in Europe, amongst different peoples and cultures. We appear different. If you look at the Middle East today, we're pretty good at identifying different groups, aren't we? We can tell the difference between Sunni and Shia, I hope. We know who the Arabs are versus the Persians or the Turks, that they're all distinct peoples. So why can't we do the same for ourselves? It's not a case of better, but instead distinct. V'lo samanu k'mishpachat adama. God, who has not made us like the nations of the lands, nor placed us like the families of the earth, who has not made our portion like theirs, nor our destiny like all their multitudes. So if I was shocked to hear from one Israeli that we're really not so distinct and that we shouldn't acknowledge these connections between us, let's go even further. A large portion of this Mishlachet had difficulty with us even using the Aleinu prayer at our worship at camp. Well, there were a lot of non-Jews working at camp. How did that make them feel? As they insisted Israel is a country for all its people, at the same time, though, we know it has a role as the Jewish state. It's paradoxical. I've come to understand it as I've sat and thought in the months since then. I can understand Israelis reacting to the influences of their society. And let's face it, the voice that speaks for Judaism in Israel is increasingly ultra-Orthodox. There's an outsized influence of radical religious authorities in Israel, as there is in every other Middle Eastern country. And unfortunately, they are people who truly believe that non-Jews, despite thousands of years of Jewish teaching to the contrary, are somehow lesser. Voices such as these make it very uncomfortable for those of us who want to articulate a positive vision of peoplehood, not a superiority complex. It's a difficult path to walk. Our worst enemies have said that we are a different people, and quite often that we had malevolent or disruptive forces at our beck and call. This is the dark side of difference. But the truth is, the same has been said about lots of other groups. Blacks, Latinos, Roma, the list goes on and on. Noting difference and making a distinction does not have to mean ranking by worth. And let's face it, we'd be fools not to note the difference. We have our own Jewish languages. We have our own Jewish music. We have our own Jewish foods. We have our own Jewish literature. Obviously, we have our own Jewish religion. Unfortunately, we even have our own Jewish genetic diseases. How is this not a people? It is impossible to rationally deny the obvious. So what do we do with that? I return to Aleinu. V'gor Aleinu lo kechol hamonam. Our destiny is not like all the others. And our destiny rests at least, and certainly not without, a continuing sense of peoplehood and being a people. Whatever else we may hope to achieve in this world and in our lives as Jews, I know there's a sine qua non. We need a Jewish people to reach those ends. There won't be any Jewish accomplishment without a Jewish people. It seems almost silly to say this. Isn't it obvious? But I think I have to. It is well noted among those of my age cohort and younger that the sense of Am Yisrael, the people of Israel, is fading. And I say this with great grief. The younger generations do not have that same sense of understanding that we are a people. We need to light the fire of pride in belonging again. We shouldn't be afraid or even reserved in stating how much better off the world is, has been, and will be for our presence in it. I know I sound like your grandmother, but we shouldn't be shy to note that in disciplines recognized by the Nobel Prize Committee, we're swinging at 100 times our weight, folks. We're 0.2% of the world's population and have been awarded 20% of the Nobel Prizes. Our accomplishments in academic fields, pedagogy, industry, entertainment, it goes on and on. We would be crazy to believe that somehow this is just by accident. Most important of all, our contribution to the life of the Spirit and the development of humankind. As was noted by one of the great lights of the 12th century, Yehuda Halevi, if there's one thing that Christians, Muslims, and Jews all agree upon, it's the centrality and worth of the Torah. Let's not forget our introduction of and rigid adherence to monotheism, at the time a radical concept that has taken root all over the world, which has continued to teach the lesson that we are all children of the same God. Our clinging to Torah and the concepts it contains of justice for all people, our obligations to the poor and the needy, and its orientation of life towards the improvement of the world are sources of pride for us and a continuing inspiration today. Isn't that why we're here? To rededicate ourselves to our most cherished values? Our job, our destiny, is to be a light to the nations, or l'goyim, to continually aim higher, to lead unafraid to more perfect forms of human relations and social justice, to strive for improvement of the human soul and the dignity of each person, to know that we celebrate a new year on Rosh Hashanah, but that every day we draw breath is an opportunity for renewal. To quote the words of Walter Sobchak, the great Jew of the Big Lebowski, 3,000 years of beautiful tradition from Moses to Sandy Koufax. You're right, I'm living in the past. Why wait for anti-Semitism to be reminded of who we are? I refuse to be defined by somebody else's hate or bigotry. Instead, I choose to take pride. I was 11 years old the first time I saw the Arch of Titus in Rome. If you've been there, you know what it is. If you haven't, I'll make a quick description. It was a celebratory arch that was erected after the Roman victory against our people in the Judean revolt that ran from the year 66 to the year 70. There are relief carvings on the inside of the arch that depict the sack of the Second Temple and the carrying off of its sacred implements and the abject prisoners in chains following along behind. I saw something below that scene. I didn't know how old it was. But below the relief carvings, carved into the stone of the arch, were the words, Am Yisrael Chai. People of Israel lives. Well, it's 1,600 years after the fall of Rome. We're still here. Despite all the attempts to humiliate and destroy us, we're still here. Our vision of a world perfected and a higher purpose for humankind is still here. We're still a people, and we still have a destiny to fulfill, one that needs us all. Am Yisrael Chai. The people of Israel live, and we are those people. Shame upon us if we forget that. Shana Tova.